leadership, the struggles to end occupation in Palestine and Western Sahara. They also play a big part in Black Lives Matter in the United States. Social movements challenge the very fiber social society tearing apart unjust and the status quo. All struggles are linked, and the use of technology in social media. Social justice activists promote good governance. They talk about good leadership, and also sometimes, as you guys have heard today, like Ahmed, they can face severe consequences. So today, our panel, we have a panel of leaders who promote social media movements across the continent to help inspire change, change and challenge you guys as delegates. What I would like to do is I would like to welcome, actually, first of all, some of the key issues that we hope to face in this panel is how to ensure independence and accountability, internal judicial systems, executive and legislative arms, understanding the potential weakness of international collaborations and social justice in Africa, deal with inadequate allocation of power in internal group relations and lasting authority rules, understanding the challenges surrounding gender-based violence and women's rights. The objectives of this panel will be, in addition to address some of the below issues, identifying key issues that are making it difficult to achieve inclusion, justice, and equality for all in Africa, exploring innovative ways of practicing to transform social justice, discussing ways in which we can achieve solidarity among young Africans. So today's chair, please help me welcome today's panel moderator, Peter Kawazi.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by wanting us to do a little bit of an exercise. Seeing that we're talking about social movements is usually not behind a cup of coffee. Usually it's done by blood, sweat, and tears. And so I'd want us to look at what we're going to do by chanting what has brought us here. And what we say is Amandla, Awethu. So I'm going to let us do that just to energize us for what we're going to do here today. Because like I've said, it doesn't come with a cup of coffee. So I know that Amandla is from the Nguni language, where it has South African origins, and it means power. And you respond by saying Awethu. So I mean, that is to us. So when we say Amandla, you say Awethu. So chant power and then you say to us. And this is something that has been used from the South African background during the fight against apartheid. This is what created solidarity. And so I think that we want to start on a note of creating solidarity amongst us and the others who are not here. So when I chant Amandla, you respond Awethu. Okay. And so wait, okay. So Amandla. Amandla. Okay, so I think that we're at liberty at any point in time when we're speaking to use the term just to get us going. So without taking much of our time, I'll take the turn to also introduce the panelists as we have here. And I would say that we are very privileged to have panelists who have very sterling careers. And what I'm going to do by way of background, it's very abridged. It's not exhaustive of all that they've accomplished. So it will seem very simplistic, but I mean, they've achieved a whole lot. So I'm going to start with the gentleman just seated by me, and you'd see that he has his red cap on. He's ready for the session. And he's a stand-in for Bobby Wine. And he goes by the name Medi Ssegawa. He's the founder and president of the Zenj HSC recruitment that is based here in Birmingham. But his nationality is Ugandan. I don't have a particularly exhaustive bio about him because, I mean, he was just co-opted. So when he has the floor, I'm going to give him the opportunity, or he could just use a minute to just give us a background.
Yes, hello. Oh, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, like you said, my name is Medi. I prefer to call myself a social, a well entrepreneur, and a wellpreneur as well. I'm a futurist, I'm an educator, and I'm also a vlogger. I prefer to call myself a pan-Alkeblanist. Alkeblan is the original name for Africa. It means Garden of Eden, right? So
so I've already done my part there. I'm going to give them a bit of time to talk, and then I'm going to go back.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I've just been asked to represent Bobby Wine. I believe in this social movement of people power. I follow it actively on Facebook, and we've got a group. And like the theme states, the power of social media in advancing movements across the world. So on Facebook, we've got a group. It's called People Power Our Power. We've got up to 157K members. And we've also set up a TV on Facebook. It's called Ghetto TV. Okay? So with this, we're advancing the cause of people power. And it's almost the same like what is happening in South Africa, the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, which is headed by Julius Malema, and other movements around the world. You've also seen people power on programs like Al Jazeera, the stream. So this is all about using the power of social media, the power of Facebook, the power of Facebook Live, and others to advance causes to create change in society. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. I think with the remaining panelists, I would take the time to have what I have with me now. So for the next panelist, we have Mrs. Karen Kaneza. She's the Africa Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. By nationality, she is Ugandan or Burundi. Okay, so she's Africa Advocacy Director within the Africa Division of the Human Rights Watch. Before joining the Human Rights Watch, she was a spokesperson for the Women and Girls Movement for Peace and Security in Burundi. She is a transitional justice practitioner with over 15 years experience in human rights programming and conflict resolution in Burundi, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and South Africa, amongst others. She coordinated a human rights program at the Desmond Tutu Peace Center, worked on the peace negotiations between the Ugandan government and the Lord Resistance Army, and advised the negotiation teams. She has worked as an independent consultant and evaluator for the international organizations, governments, and African organizations, including the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission of Rwanda, the Forum of Conscience in Sierra Leone, United Nations Development Program, UNDP, in Uganda, Uganda Ministry of Justice, Search for Common Ground, Global Rights, and the Juba Initiative Fund, and of the peace processes between the government of Uganda and the Lord's Resistance Army. Karen holds a master's degree in human rights law and international humanitarian law from the University of Western Cape in South Africa. So please let's give Karen a round of applause. Next to Karen is Professor Atta Mutumbara. I hope I get it right. So he's a former Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Zimbabwe. So I told you that we have people with a very sterling career. So Professor Atta Mutambara is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. He is the author of the new trilogy, In Search of Elusive Zimbabwean Dream, which he has here. We'll give him time to speak a little about it later. An autobiography of thought leadership. He is one of the three principals who created and led the government of the national unity. Those of us who followed Zimbabwe politics would know. He's one of the three. The other two were Prime Minister Shangarai and then President Robert Mugabe. As DPM, his key functions included assisting the PM in policy formulation and supervision of policy implementation. He worked on three national efforts: Shared National Vision, Rebranding Zimbabwe, and a National Infrastructure Master Plan. Professor Mutambara is currently a visiting full professor at the University of Johannesburg. He is also an independent technology and strategy consultant based in South Africa. He was recently the president of the African News Agency. His primary mandate included media technology innovation, digital platform development, and harnessing social media tools. He was a driving force behind the usage of artificial intelligence and deployment of intelligent algorithms in media, resulting in the development of new business modules. He is a chartered engineer, a fellow of the Institute of Engineering and Technology, and a professional engineer, a fellow of the Zimbabwe Institute of Engineers, a fellow of the Zimbabwe Academy of Sciences, a senior member of the IEE. He was a research scientist at NASA, visiting professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, professor of FAMU, FSU, and the management consultant with McKinsey and Company. He has written 2 electrical engineering books. In 2007, Professor Mutumbara was accorded the World Economic Forum Young Global Leader status and subsequently attended World Economic Forum events from 2007 to 2013 in Davos, China, India, and Africa. He holds a PhD in robotics and macrotronics and an MSc in computer engineering, both from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He graduated with a BSc honors in electrical engineering from the University of Zimbabwe. What I didn't say here is that he has also been a former president of the Oxford Africa Society. So let's give an applause to him. Of the professions that I know where you keep a title for life, is either you've been an ambassador, so they call you, whether your post ends, they call you ambassador until you die. And when you're a judge, they call you judge until you die. So we have a former judge here. So Professor Kate O'Regan, former judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. She's a professor of human rights law in the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford, and the inaugural director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford University. Professor O'Regan served as one of the first judges of the Constitutional Court of South Africa from 1994 to 2009, and also as an ad hoc judge of the Supreme Court of Namibia from 2010 to 2016. She has an honorary, she's an honorary bencher of the Lincoln's Inn, an honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an honorary fellow of the British Academy, and a recipient of 7 honorary degrees. She's also served as on the boards of many NGOs working in the fields of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and equality. Please let's give applause for the judge in the building. And last but by no means the least, I have the honor to also introduce Mickey Mej. Okay, so she is the director of the Prostitution Survivor Movement, Corneli, and advocacy manager, Embrace Dignity, based in South Africa. Mickey is the advocacy manager of Embrace Dignity, a feminist human rights organization that challenges gendered power. Mickey is a feminist, abolitionist, and a human rights and gender activist. She has significant professional and personal experience in issues surrounding the sex trade, as well as the system of prostitution and its harms. Mickey is the lead survivor of prostitution activist and advocate in South Africa, advocating for anti-sex trade laws that benefit the women who are bought, sold, and exploited in a system of prostitution. Mickey founded a survivor movement in Africa called Corneli, which is the first ever of its kind. Mickey has a vision of a prostitution-free and gender-equal world where no girl or woman is bought, sold, and exploited. A world where no woman or girl is commodified or objectified. With an applause, let's receive Ms. Mickey. So now we've had the honor to know who our panelists are. Like I've said, it's not exhaustive of everything that they've achieved. So while they speak, I'm sure they'll bring in some shared experiences which is relevant to the context of what we'll be discussing today. By way of what we'll be doing, I am going to give the panelists a first opportunity to give a brief introductory remark on the subject that we'll be discussing today. The chair has introduced us to what the objectives for the session are, and we're mindful that if we are to use colloquials or any native language, let's try to explain it. Not all of us here would be able to understand what we mean. So I would want to start with my immediate left. So 5 minutes, and please, let's really stick to 5 minutes. That's the maximum time that you have to make a remark. So we could start with you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Well, I've been hijacked to represent Honorable Chagulanyi, or mostly known by his stage name, Bobby Wine. Well, Bobby Wine is quite an inspirational person. So at his tender age of 37, he's changing the world. And if you look at the words of Mahatma Gandhi, you know, change starts with you. You know, it starts in your community. It starts in your home, in your area. That's where change starts from. But now things have changed. We've got the power of social media and the internet. So this gives us actually a bigger platform to create positive change in society. And when you look at Honorable Bobby Wine and his movement, the People Power movement, it's not something new. It's happening before in Philippines, whereby people or the community rise up to fight injustice and cause social change for the better of society, for the betterment of society. Now, Honorable Bobby Wine represents this kind of change Mahatma Gandhi preaches. So you find that in Africa, there's the director of Oxfam. Her name is Honorable Winnie Byanyima. She recently said that dictators in Africa have enhanced the power to rig elections. So elections now is just a stamp, just for continuity. It doesn't show the aspirations of the people. So isn't it high time we, as people who believe in the African unity or Pan-Africanism, to create this change, to aspire so that our voices at elections are represented in the choices we like to represent us as a society. So this is the background of People Power. Through this movement, different platforms have been set up, like the theme of this session: how can we use social media to advance this kind of causes? So there are so many tools at disposal. Personally, when I'm running my business, I use the power of social media. I use things like Facebook, I use things like Instagram and YouTube. Right now, this session, we can stream it live to the whole world and have so many people joining in this discussion. So that is the power of social media. The same kind of movement, if you are to read about great Africans like Thomas Sankara, he believed in the same kind of thing, advancing social change. And I come from Uganda, and the president, I think he took over power when I was only 2 years old. But look at me now, I've grown up, I'm almost in my mid-30s, and he's still the same person in there. You know, I'm not saying that someone staying in power is a bad thing. If you look at Singapore, a story, the president, I think, was it Lincoln and something. He stayed for over 30 years, but then he had a vision for his country. You know, but as Africans, I think it's high time we had a rethink. One of the great men in the UK, his name is, he was a former prime minister, Winston Churchill. He once said that actually democracy is the best system of governance, except those before it. So isn't it time we come up with something new, a different system of governance if democracy is failing? It might work for the UK, it might work for Greece, which is the home place for democracy, but is it working for Africa? So it is us as young people. One of the keynote speakers was thinking about thinking outside the box. So can't we think about a new system of governance? So personally, I'm proposing what we call the Ubuntu system of governance. So who knows what Ubuntu means? Ubuntu.
Okay,
yes,
so
what's Ubuntu?
I'm going to have to interrupt. Yeah. The introductory remarks is to give us a background.
Oh, background.
And I've said at the maximum 5 minutes, I think that we would have to stay within time if we're to do this. So I'm going to ask that you end it here. You have subsequent opportunities to do that. So the next speaker.
All right, thank you for the opportunity.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, moderator, for this opportunity. My name is Karine Kaneza-Nantulia. I am very honored to be sitting with two comrades from South Africa, actually, where I I would say I found my my love, actually, for the work I do. I like to call myself a human rights strugglist. As the moderator said, I work for Human Rights Watch as the Africa Advocacy Director. We work in different countries, around 22, 23, almost 23 countries. Almost 23 because in one of them we don't actually have access. We've just lost access recently, and that is Cameroon. So some of my work touches really on 4 types of conflict. I advocate for a more exposure and a better handling of human rights violations on 4 types of violations. One is the complex emergency we see in West Africa, Nigeria, with Boko Haram, Niger, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, Mali. The other type is really the environmental degradation that we see spreading throughout some parts of the continent. The third one is really about the justice and accountability, which I'm going to talk about in the next 2 minutes, I hope. And the last one is really about the violations linked to civil and political rights. Talking about justice and accountability, recently the African Union has adopted what we call a transitional justice policy, a laudable initiative, great opportunity for the continent to actually look at what has been done when we talk about gross human rights violations. As you remember, we had the tragic experience of dealing with genocide in Rwanda. We've had recurring conflicts in Burundi. Now what we see another wave, another type of conflicts that start with counterterrorism activities, but along the way fail. And what we see a rise of self-defense militia group arising more and more. At the heart of what we see is that criminal justice, anything that has to do with accountability, with dealing with past legacies, is actually always swept aside. And we tend to look at peace agreement and peace negotiations as a process that touches on our communal values of negotiation and dialogue. But while doing so, governments will tend not to look at the issue of accountability. And that is one of our main challenges today. Responding to that challenge, what we have seen, and I love the fact that we're talking about social movements, because one of the key ingredients for our countries, for our African governments to actually deal with gross human rights violations, it's political will.
Okay,
we need to have political will.
I'm going to have to make a bit of
30 seconds.
Adjustments. Okay, 30 seconds and then...
10 seconds.
Yeah, so the subsequent speakers, I am told that we have to adjust our time. So it shouldn't look biased that the 2 have used 5. We're going to have to do so in 2 to 3 minutes introductory remarks. So I think that let's pass it on to the next person.
The new actors are actually the youth civic movements. Thank you.
Very briefly, I'm here to listen. I'm here to take questions, so I won't say much. All I can say is that progress and change rises, they rise or fall on social movements. Social movements provide an opportunity for everyone to be a change maker, to be a game changer. So the second thing I'm going to emphasize is documentation. We must write. Africans are not writing. And I've got so the books I've done myself to walk the talk. Why? Because you find that there's so many people who are active in the UK, in Africa, on the continent, Africans, but they're not putting pen to paper. So we must create counter narratives. We must document our experiences. We must be able to communicate and share global best practice. So in my books, you find the things we did as students in Zimbabwe and also at Oxford, and then what we did when we were politically active in Zimbabwe. So be the change you seek to see in the world, but more importantly, documentation. And again, we go to Churchill. When Chechu was asked after the Second World War, when he lost elections, they said, Mr. Chechu, how is history going to judge you? And he says, very positively, because I'm going to write the history. and Chechu has got 2 volumes on the Second World War. So change makers must write.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to the organizers, and congratulations on putting together a great conference. So I started studying law in South Africa in 1977, which was just after 1976, which was the uprising of students in Soweto against being taught in Afrikaans. That really is learning law in the shadow of a social movement. And over the next 15 years, we saw the rise of social movements across South Africa. And my experience was as working particularly as a lawyer for trade unions, as a lawyer for people facing forced removals, and also as a lawyer for people who were political activists. And I really learned a few things out of that. The first was that never give up, because although in the darkest days of apartheid, the possibilities of overturning apartheid state seemed really unlikely, it was a very powerful state. Actually, it did become possible. We can all argue as to why it did happen. There are lots of contributing factors, but there's no doubt the social movement was very important. And I think that sense of hope remains with me even today, given the dark things that we see. It is always possible, and social movements are very important to it. The second thing I learned was that law, and perhaps this is something I learned on the bench as well, is that law is an important tool for social movements. It's not a solution to every problem, but when connected with a social movement, it can make an extraordinary difference in our societies. And so thinking about law as one of the tools that social movements can use is very important. And the third thing is to recognize that actually really changing societies requires an enormous amount of grassroots footwork, talking to people, knocking on doors. It's not necessarily, it's one of my worries about social media, is that it seems like you can change the world, but I'm not sure that it is. I think actually human interaction, really talking to people, the hard work that political movements and grassroots movements do on a daily basis cannot be replaced simply by a tweet. And so I think that's something we need to think about. Thank you.
I'm not even a good tweeter because I normally have a lot to say and the characters are quite few. But I'll just start by quoting Steve Biko: the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I'm saying this because I've said in my years of having worked with prostituted women or women in prostitution, both in my time in the street and in my time when working in social movement, I am yet to come across one woman who said, I grew up wanting to be a sex worker, the most paid high-paid sex worker, and I want to run the biggest brothel ever. Yet, when we listen around, when people are claiming to be representing women in prostitution, they go around saying women want prostitution to be recognized as work. In the entire continent of Africa, we hear this. There's a movement called the African Sex Worker Alliance, but there is no ownership of poor Black African women to this. Hence, I felt that there was a need for me to start up Kwanele, and Kwanele is the Nguni word for enough. And in asserting ourselves that we need to come forward and speak for ourselves so that we are not guided. One thing that I've learned about Africans is that we tend to be followers of revolutions are introduced to us, and we are told by those who have colonized us that this is what we should be fighting for. And I think it's high time that we stood up for ourselves and defined our own problems and defined the things that we need to be fixing. Like Dr. Ibrahim Mo said yesterday, that we need to sit down and do some introspection and stop just pointing out that it is because of that, it is because of that person, she did that, she did not do that, who did what, this is why. Yes, we do agree, especially in South Africa's very, very, very young democracy. maybe I don't call it a democracy. I call it a democracy because I don't see the democracy in it. I call it a democracy. But I mean, in South Africa's 25-year-old, very young democracy, the youngest that I know about in Africa, I tend to see that all struggles that are related to black people or the indigenous people of Africa are spearheaded by white privileged academics. And these are struggles that are given to us, especially if it's not going to benefit us, especially if it's going to destroy us. Like the issue of prostitution, it's being spearheaded by white privileged academics because it's not going to benefit the poor black child. It's going to keep us there. In poverty and doing all sorts of things and not even prospering in life and developing. But when you turn around and you look at the Fees Must Fall campaign, we didn't see white privileged academics spearheading that because they knew that should we be successful, once we get quality education, we are going to be powerful and it's going to benefit us and it's not going to benefit them. And there was no drive in it. So I feel that the work that we do should actually, make us relevant in the sense that we need to step forward for our own issues and start saying what it is that we really want and not get it defined for us.
Okay. Thank you for your remarks. And okay, so we're going to ask 2 rounds of questions, but due to the constraints of time, we're going to ask that we try to make a response in a minute, if we can. Okay, so there may be the instance where I'll ask both of your questions at the same time, in which instance, when I get to the next round, I'll skip you. So if your questions look like they are sort of tied, I'll ask both of them together. So I'm going to start with Professor Kate Oregon, Judge. So from the 1960s, social movements have been founded upon Olsen's logic of collective action. Now, he tried to explain why people participate in public protest, even though free riding would seem like a rational choice to them. Would want to know, why do people protest through social movements at the first place? But in your case, I would want to add your second question. So this global upsurge in the streets through new social movements, we see that it creates a conundrum for human rights groups, and I know your human rights. I mean, on the one hand, it creates a tsunami of unpredictable change, while on the other hand, it promises new opportunities. What must human rights groups do to avoid being rendered irrelevant in this new space? It seems a space where the status quo is being, thrown out, and then another form, because, if we wanted to change a government, rationally we'll have to wait for 4 years or whatever term limits have been assigned before we do that. And human rights institutions and groups are there to make sure that some of these tenets are adhered to. But once we get into the streets, we damn all the consequences, we damn the structures. So in the wake of all of it, first, why do we do that? And then subsequently, what must human rights groups do such that they are not rendered irrelevant in this whole space?
Those are difficult questions. I think human rights really are about some fundamental values. And to me, it is less important about what groups do and what more important in a sense about how we hold on to those values. And the values are that all people should be treated of equal worth, that the state should allow people to speak, should not be imprisoning people. It's shocking that today this panel is lost a speaker by somebody who is in jail, probably for their political views. So we need to hang on to those very principal values, because there's no doubt to me that change is important, but societies probably always need change. And what quite often happens is that you can have a revolutionary movement that gets itself in power and may have lots of good intentions, but actually those fundamental human rights that we still need, all power needs to be held to account always. And if we let go of that idea, we're likely to be, we're likely to end up once again with unaccountable power. So I think we've got to remember what the fundamental principles are. Remember that we always have something to learn and we're not always right. But to stand by those principles in all circumstances in relation to all forms of power, social power as well as state power.
Okay, so how do you tie that to one of your discourses that I followed on YouTube, where you try to look at, okay, the Declaration of Human Rights, and there's a paid vacation in one of the, paid vacation supposed to be fundamental human rights, something. And in your discussions, I think that one of the points you tried to raise is that if the fundamentals, what we try to say as fundamental, how really fundamental is it to all of us universally? Because I don't think that in some spaces they'd want to consider paid vacations.
So this is the Universal Declaration
of Human Rights,
It
yes.
says that people should be entitled to paid leave. Well, I have to say, my background's a trade union lawyer. I fundamentally believe that people who are employed are entitled to paid leave. I think that human beings need rest, and I think the idea that I think we should fight for the idea that workers are entitled to limited hours, to decent work, and to paid vacation. Now, we might live in a different society, so what we constitute as human rights would differ. If we didn't live in a labor market environment, we lived in an entirely subsistence environment, we might think differently about that. But in an industrial state, I feel very strongly that workers are entitled to paid leave. And I think that if we're not careful and the state doesn't intervene, workers can be terribly exploited. It's happening in the world today as we speak.
Okay. Professor, so even before the widespread, criticism against the former regime in your government, in your country, Zimbabwe, while in the university, you publicly critiqued and questioned the status quo. You were accused of being supported by foreign powers and an enemy of the state. Does it matter that some social movements in Africa are driven by outside stimuli in the form of inducements from aid donors or interest groups? That's if there are. In fact, this notion is supported by a study by Ellis and Van Kessel, who argue that financial dependence from external donors, directly or indirectly, via local NGOs, is a characteristic feature of several social movements in Africa. So are social movements a conduit for an imperialist agenda?
I think the narrative that says that foreigners are driving NGOs in Africa to cause problems for governments is coming from dictators who do not believe that Africans have personal agency. Young people in Sudan, in Egypt, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, who are fighting for change are doing so because they want to do so. When we're fighting for our independence in the continent in the 50s, 70s, young people again had personal agency to say, we want to create a better society, a better continent for ourselves. So the narrative about the foreigner, the narrative about external influenza is normally created by those who want to discredit the efforts of young people, to discredit the efforts of change makers. Of course, there's always a danger when there are activities for foreigners or others to try to drive the agenda, set the agenda by using money. But I'm saying fundamentally, the source of the struggle, the motivation behind the struggle is genuine. It's driven by Africans trying to make a difference in Sudan, in Egypt, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Uganda. So first and foremost, let us show respect. Bobby Wine is behind bars right now. Africans are being harassed on the continent for trying to make a difference. So yes, there's always the potential, the danger of infiltration, the danger of manipulation, but fundamentally, we must give credit to those who seek to make a difference.
Are you suggesting that it doesn't matter who pays, for it? Because, we know he who calls the piper calls the tune. So do we damn where the funding comes from to do such things? Because, if the principle is what it is and the underlying motive for it is that, our economic issues, our social issues that are prevalent and concern us is what we're advocating for. It doesn't matter who pays for it.
No, it does matter. What we're emphasizing is that the agenda, the motivation is genuine. The agenda, the motivation is African. Of course, we must be careful not to be used by those who have their own agenda. Of course, he who pays the paper calls the tune. But we're saying that as Africans, as long as we know what we want, freedom in 1957, independence in 1980, 1994, those are products of African activism. But in the process, there's always the danger of somebody who's got their own agenda, who can pay for their own agenda. But we're saying let us show respect to those who stand up and seek to make a difference because they're motivated by what is good for Africa.
Okay.
But yes, of course, money matters, he who or she who pays matters, but fundamentally, the African is going to be master of their own destiny, as we see in history now.
Okay, I'll leave that when it comes to the panel, to the questions from the audience. So, Mickey, given your experiences both as someone who has experienced the atrocities of persons engaged in commercial sex work and now helping those engaged in it to transition into other forms of economic activity, what would you say are some of the key issues that are making it difficult for Africa to achieve inclusive justice and equality for all?
Point of correction, it wasn't commercial sex. That there, then.
Yes.
So it's not work, never was. It was a means of survival when there were very limited options, caused by oppression, apartheid, persistent inequalities that continues to limit the options of poor black women in South Africa. I would want to say, since when I started speaking out against prostitution, I have received a lot of hostility, both from women's organizations and those who claim to be feminists, because again, it is not a popular. Position. Africans tend to be populists. Whenever it is that an idea is introduced, especially if it's introduced by white people and academics and powerful people and privileged people, we tend to come across as right for many people. And then when you come out of a village somewhere or some township, poor township of Khayelitsha, and you start saying something, people do not take you seriously. And it is quite unfortunate that Professor Arthur was saying that we do have our own minds, but at the same time, money is something that drives us, and politics of the stomach are very dangerous for Africa. And many Africans' politics are motivated by their stomach, where the bread is buttered today, but we are not thinking about our future generations. Yes, the campaign for the decriminalization might put food on my table right now, but what will it do for the country if it's successful and if it's implemented? So that's one part. So we as an abolitionist movement, we've been hindered because we do not get resources, we do not get support, not even from international organizations that are supposed to be for human rights. And bear in mind that prostitution is regarded in international human rights law as a violation of human rights and undermining the dignity of the self-worth of the person.
Okay, so
Yeah, I'm here. So what we're going to do is we're going to, the first two questions that we get, we'll ask the rest of the panelists, the ones that haven't spoken. But because of the time, we need to make sure that we get you guys to engage and start asking questions. So we're going to take questions from the audience. Yep. Go first.
So I'd like to ask the gentleman from Uganda, so at what point do we cross over from free speech to maybe hate speech or speech that isn't welcome? I'm aware that in your country, Stella Yanzi right now is either under house arrest or she's been arrested with reference to a poem that was written about the president on his birthday or the day after his birthday. And some people commented on the poem as being a bit strongly worded. And I know that the movement is strongly behind her as well, and she's also fighting a cause. So I'd like to throw that to you. And then I'd like to, just a quick question to Mickey as well, with regards to fighting for women, sex workers, and the likes. There's a disturbing trend about what some of our African sisters are doing in Dubai, and some of these have to do with this isn't like it's kind of voluntary. Again, related to what you said, something about the stomach, money, being motivated by monetary gains. So I just want to know if the scope and ambits of your work does cover such things. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions, but please, let's keep them short. Yeah? The guy in the back.
Thank you. I'll keep it short. My name's Femi. My question is to Professor Arthur Mutambara. I was just wondering, both of you and the man from Uganda have brought up Churchill, and you brought Churchill up as an example of why we should think about who writes. We should write more, and his example of writing the history books. But if we go to Kenya, Churchill was the author of the concentration camps against the Mau Mau people. He caused famines in India. He was an imperialist in Africa. And so your example of Churchill, doesn't it show that we have to be wary of how we write these things, what we write, and especially those of us who go through privileged institutions like this? I myself, an Oxford graduate, are very literate, have the power and the means and the connections to write and be published and make films, etc. The Churchill example specifically, the thing of I intend to write history, so it will be nice to me, shows that we need to be sometimes careful about who is writing and what we write.
Thank you. Yeah, so that would be the last question, and then we'll do another round. Yeah.
Thank you for all those interventions. They were very insightful. It's a sort of question come comment that is directed to the gentleman from the Uganda, Professor Mutambara and Professor Regan. At what point do we move into political movements as opposed to remaining within social movements? Because this culture of insurrection and confrontation is important, yes, but surely there should be a dividing line. And Professor Mutambara, you moved from the political and now seem to be advocating for the social. So what informed that logical process? Because ultimately the social movements would be operating, Professor Regan, outside the framework of law, and we want to come to a point of law, and we recognize the corruptibility or the corruption of law, the substance of law, the Malabo Protocol being an example where unconstitutional changes of government are criminalized. So a social movement cannot feasibly bring about the change of government. And the last point is, with respect to prostitution, perhaps you can just clarify what your position is. Do you want the status quo of criminalization of prostitution to remain? Criminalization affecting those very women who you seem be advocating on behalf of? Just a point of clarity, perhaps.
Can we just get the 2 people that asked their questions to state their name and where they're on behalf of? So yeah.
I'm Jordan Donyema, I'm a DPhil in law student, yeah.
He already said. Yeah, he already said.
I'm Louisa Chinedu KK from Nigeria. I'm a student at the Blavatnik School of Government. Thank you.
Yeah, so can we get those 3?
Okay, so I think one was directed to you, so we could start with you.
Okay, so Louisa asked, when does free speech cross over to hate speech, right? Personally, I believe free speech is an inherent human right. We're entitled to free speech. And from one of my experiences, I happen to be one of a member of a WhatsApp group. It's called Uganda Health Diaspora. And one point I posted an article about the presence of a Himatu's empire in the Great Lakes region. And I received scorn from the people. They are like, this is hate speech. But where did I get this from? Actually, this was from WikiLeaks 2001. There was a leak, and actually the president of Zimbabwe then, Robert Mugabe, there was a fallout between him and the president of Uganda, Museveni. They were in France. So Mugabe stood in front of Museveni and said, Museveni, you're creating a Himatusi empire in the Great Lakes region, and I'll fight that tooth and nail. So once I earmarked this in the group, WhatsApp group, people are like, this is hate speech. And for me, I believe this is free speech, and I'm quoting from a source which is credible. Then the other thing about Stella Nyanzi being in prison, yeah, she spoke her mind actually. So this is part of, we call it vulgar activism. You know, yeah, it's vulgar. You can actually try to hit centers of power. It's about speaking truth to power. Okay, and if you look at if you have read the book, The 48 Laws of Power, it talks about a lot depends on reputation, so you have to guard it with your life. So I think what the president is doing to Stella Nyanzi is just asserting himself, his power, you know, so.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so could we please, I think you've addressed your question, yes. So should want to know, Karen, before he comes, on the social movements being politicized by foreign, when they support
the agenda of the foreign, the rhetoric about the foreign agenda. I just wanted to say something very quickly. We are witnessing today a third struggle for the continent. We fought against colonialism, we fought against slavery today, and we fought against military dictatorship. Today, we are fighting for the institutionalization of human rights. And when we hear a rhetoric coming from really African autocrats around where the money comes from, we also need to understand that that delegitimizes the purpose of these civic movements. And it is not a new accusation. It was said about Lumumba, it was said about many leaders, it was said about Mandela. So at every time when you see a rise of an opposition, a critical mass in our political arenas, that is the first excuse and the first accusation that's going to come on the other side. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Professor Mutambara.
We're not romanticizing Churchill. We're actually making the point you are making. The authorities on African history must be Africans. For those who studied history, Zulu, Xhosa, Shona, who are the authorities? A.G.P. Taylor, David Beach, C.O. Ranger. No, let us have Africans be the authorities on African history. When I say the American Revolution, the authorities are not Indian or Chinese. When I say Chinese history, the authorities are not British. So we are saying as Africans, we must be masters of the narratives about the continent. We do that by writing. It was tongue-in-cheek to show how there is no such thing as neutral history. We as Africans must be the creators of African history. Now, in terms of social and political activism, they feed into each other. Social movements, some of them become political parties. Political parties also influence social movements. What I think is important is we can't all be politicians. We can't all be MPs or mayors or presidents, or we can be active. Social movements allow everybody to be a player. You can then convert the social movement into a political party, that's you. But we need them to continue being active as social movements, but they fit into each other. What I want to emphasize is that it doesn't matter where you are, because sometimes people say, oh, I'm going to be an academic, I'll be a judge, I'll be a journalist. My view is that you'll never be respected as an African until the African continent has done well as a continent. You know, when I used to go to Davos and speak, they would ask me, you say something very, where are you from? And I dodged the question. No, we like what you're saying, but where are you from? And then when I say I'm from Zimbabwe, they're like, come on. If you are that smart, how come your country's got cholera? If you are that smart, when are your next elections? So your superstardom, your rock star status depends on the success or failure of every African on the continent and the diaspora.
Professor.
Have we answered?
Already, yeah, I think that she had there was one that was linked to her.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I can add much to what Professor Mutambara has had to say, and he's right, obviously. In a free society, we will have movement between social movements and politics, and that's good. I do fundamentally believe that really what we need to do is build free societies where people can express their views without being put in jail. They're obvious, and that's the big challenge. And then people will move from one to the other. And in many ways, for political movements not to become sclerotic, not just to be cheerleaders for a particular leader, they need the social movements to keep them honest. So there's a good relationship between social movements and political movements, but we know that the challenge is to keep our societies free for that to be able to happen.
And lastly, Mickey, just before we take the other round.
Clarity. We are not calling for prostitution to continue to be criminalized. What we are calling for is the decriminalization of the persons who are bought, sold, and exploited within the system, which a vast majority of them are women. And we are calling for the penalization of those who buy sex or sexual services, which a majority of them are men. And we are calling for the continued criminalization of those who keep brothels, of those who pimp other people, because we understand that no one has the right to sell another person for their own the financial gratification. But we also do understand that prostitution is perpetuated by patriarchy, a patriarchy that which renders women as second-class citizens, to be bought, sold, and exploited, and to be objectified. And I will tell you this, a friend of mine who drives an Uber, who's a woman, told me a story just on Tuesday that a man whom she was transporting from Cape Town International to CBD asked her how much she's making a night. And when she gave this man the figure, this man was bold enough to actually tell her, I will triple that amount, I want to spend the night with you. Do you know why that man did that? Because he finds that it's normalized for men to tag women on prices when they go around, treat them as commodities. If I can pay 10,000 for this one, maybe that one I can pay 15,000 because of whatever classes that they use. So that's one thing that we need to understand. But we are also calling for the investment of our governments in the emancipation and empowerment of young women and girls, so that we do not find ourselves in situations whereby the only thing that we can do as a means of survival is to sell our bodies. Stella, my sister, voluntarily and choice, there is no such in prostitution, even if you hear people say that. In my 9 years, when I was in prostitution, I defended it because that was my only power banner. You might hear those women in Dubai telling you that, oh no, I chose this. Then we need to define what choice is. It is when a person has had an opportunity, the right, and the power. And those lack for women in prostitution. Voluntarily means that not being coerced. In the system of prostitution, people are coerced into unwanted sexual intercourse. It doesn't become wanted simply because this man is paying. No, I still don't want to have sex with him, but I do want to feed my children, and I do want to pay my university fees. So I am coerced into having sex with this man. There is nothing voluntarily or choice when it comes to prostitution.
Wow. Okay, so
Yeah, so let's do one more set of questions, and that will be it. So we'll get one question from you, a question from you, and then a question from you. If for us to be able to get more questions, we have to keep the questions and the answers very, very short. If not, then people won't get the opportunity because we've got 7 minutes left. Yeah, so say your names, literally 2 sentences or 1 sentence if you can, and the answers very short, please, as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Christopher Mpanga, and I'm a law student at Oxford Brookes University. My question is, with social movements, if we look at different movements, for example, Yoweri Museveni, 1996, 10-point program, very good program came in place, Egypt. So when these people get into power, they lose the whole vision. So my question is, what next after social movements? How do we keep these leaders accountable to the principles that they aspired for? Thank you very much.
Whom are you directing that to? Or it's a free, okay. So, all right.
Hi, thank you so much for the insight. My question is for Karine. I've done a lot of work on peace building, and I was wondering how in those big institutions like Human Rights Watch, how you understand and deal with intergenerational trauma. Because the place of trauma is so not well understood and dealt with. And I was wondering how you guys put this into your policy. Thank you.
Did you say your name? And then and we'll be asking those 2 last questions.
I guess my name is Kenny Mwicha. I'm at the Bonavere Institute of Human Rights here at Oxford. My question is, what are some of the practical steps that we can take? Because the problem that we are seeing now is that human rights and rule of law, we have the systems in place, we have the laws, but we don't have that social factor. Like, how can we leverage people power to kind of like guarantee that these laws or these approaches are actually followed in government? Yeah.
And we've got 5 minutes left, so if you can ask just two of the panelists.
Karin, would you want to answer any of them? Sorry, Mickey. Would you want to?
No, can we get Karen to ask
Karen
first, and then we'll get Mickey to answer afterwards?
Trauma. How do you deal with trauma? You deal with it through building coalitions. There's expertise everywhere. It's about building, respecting memories and bringing the required expertise for that. How do we move from social movements to really maintaining that spirit within the political arena? It's the same principle. We need to build critical masses from different people. In the 90s, you had political leaders coming from student movements. Today, we have professionals like in Sudan and in Algeria. You have students. They have to all come together and reshape a different political dispensation. Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Mutumbara.
Yeah, very, very briefly, how do we keep in check these visionaries who become dictators? Number one, build strong institutions. But it's not enough. Build a value system that backs up the strong institutions. Constitutionalism, the behavior, the culture, the tradition of respecting the Constitution. Number one, have a strong Constitution that has term limits. And then secondly, have a value system, for example, constitutionalism, which is the culture, the behavior, the tradition of respecting that Constitution.
Yes, we're going to get Mickey to answer the last question. You want to repeat?
Okay, so systems are not in place fully in Africa. I mean, with regards to the system of prostitution, we only have 2 countries that have legalized, which is Ethiopia and Senegal. And it's not working, but people are not challenging. But I feel that looking at the South African, situation, even like the question that the other brother was asking about, what is it that we can do to hold our leaders accountable? You find that young people are at each and every single car wash. Maybe you've seen them, Professor, where they are drinking and doing all sorts of things, and nobody cares about the world. If you stop somebody and ask them something about whatever that matters politically, nobody knows anything. So it then becomes a problem, because then people seem to want to point, that person did not do this, that person did not do this. Currently in South Africa, prostitution is totally criminalized since 2007, totally, but 1957 partially. So we are working towards, reforming that. And what we right now need is men coming forward, educating other men that it is not okay to purchase sex. And by purchasing sex does not make you a philanthropy. Philanthropy, because men tend to say, I'm helping this woman. If you want to help this person, why must you exploit them for you to help them in exchange? So by purchasing sex is not philanthropy. And the other thing is that real men just do not buy sex. And if you know that I'm going to say yes in any case, why don't you just ask me, let me say yes or no without being coerced? And the last thing that we also just need to understand is that Africa would benefit from all its people having reached its full potential, especially its women. And prostitution, or the system of prostitution rather, keeps women in bondage, where they only understand that the only thing that they can do is to go around and service men for their fantasies. So we need to move away from that, and we need men to start speaking forward. Yesterday, I was astonished, or both impressed, and also kind of when Dr. Mo was speaking about family planning, I found that it was very bold of him, because all this family planning that he's talking about, when you talk about sexual reproductive health rights and everything, if there's a pill to be swallowed, it's for the woman to swallow. If there's an injection to be taken, it's for the woman to take. And he is very bold and saying this, but we don't hear that amount of boldness when it comes to prostitution. Could it be that it's because it doesn't burden men and it benefits men rather? You know, men can just go and pick a woman and do whatever it is that they want to do and, you know, satisfy their fantasies, that they are not speaking about this issue. You do not hear men speaking about the system of prostitution.
Please react to this other question.
Can we, guys, we have to finish. Yeah. Can I just get the 2 last questions?
Okay,
and then we can just finish the panel. And then your question, and that was it.
Sinclair Skinner. My question is just real quick. What countries would you say, and this might be for the professor, maybe the top 5 countries that are effective at social justice for black people or people of African descent, like globally? If you're going to say these would be like the top 5, because sometimes it seems like we give black people, or we give Africa a certain standard that the world, I live in America and the police kill us. So I know if America's a standard, we're in trouble. So I'm trying to figure out what would be the top 5 countries, would you say, that have got institutions and got the system right and use black people, though, as the standard, not someone else?
Okay, so next one,
the
and
last
then,
question is there.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Parimala Devi Mori. I'm a legal professional from Mauritius, and I wanted to ask, what do you think is the role of the African Union in all this, in relation to the social movements challenging status quo for good governance? Do you believe that the African Union should bear a role in protecting such movements, especially when it comes to freedom of speech? And I hear that some people are going to jail, are being imprisoned for expressing their views on the government. Because in my country, I know that recently there have been laws which have been put in place to prevent people from commenting online about the government. So I was wondering, what are your views on that?
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
We get that question asked by Kate.
So Judge Kate, and then Mehdi also answers the other one. So Judge, I think he was asking, I think he specifically asked that you would prefer that you answer that. The gentleman. No, Oh, okay.
No, can we get the judge to answer the question about the African Union?
About African Union,
yes,
and then, okay.
And then can we get the...
Yeah, okay.
I think talk about the African Union. Yes, of course we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is a really important regional human rights document with 2 institutions which seek to protect it, the African Commission and the African Court. And the African Commission has been very strong on free speech issues. I have to say that its decisions are not always implemented by African member states who have signed and ratified the African Convention. And I think across Africa we should be more conscious of this very important document and the institutions that protect it. And we should call upon our governments to be respectful and implement the orders that it makes. I agree with you that we should, that the machinery is actually now there. Where the machinery is currently lacking is that at the moment, getting to the African Court is difficult unless your country has adopted a protocol, which Mauritius hasn't, as far as I recall, to allow individuals other than the state to bring a case before the African Court. Anybody can go to the Commission, but not everybody can go to the court. And I think that this is a really important mechanism for protecting freedom of speech, protecting human rights across the continent.
Okay, so Mehdi, you answer the other one.
The other one was what happens next after the social movement. If you look at the case of Uganda, Museveni, when he came to power, like he said, he had this beautiful 10-point program, but then he got derailed. How about Bobby Wine? What if he comes into power tomorrow? So what can stop him from becoming another Museveni? So if you look at democracy and in hindsight, the words of Churchill, that democracy is the best system of governance except those before it. If you explore further into Europe, a country like Switzerland, they've got a kind of system of governance whereby the president actually is represented by 7 people. So Africa, most countries like where I come from, Uganda is almost the same size as the UK, but we are very ethnically diverse. We've got up to 53 different ethnicities of people. How about if we divided Uganda just, for the purposes of elections into 7 regions, whereby each region maybe sends 1 person to form a presidency. So instead of having Bobby Wine at the end, at the top, we have 7 different people and those form a presidency. This is what is happening in Switzerland. And in that way, we can curtail another dictator rising to power. Because imagine if Museveni is demented, if he's got dementia, and he's got all this power of the military before him, he's going to run the country down with him. He's in his 80s, he could be demented. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not saying he is. I've got medical background, so as the person ages, the brain ages as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Could we just get the question?
Professor Mutambara.
Yeah.
Very tough question, my brother. And I wouldn't put America in there at all. Because I lived in America, that's a plantation there. Number one, I'm looking at the socio, political, and economic conditions of black people. It's a tough question, but I'll venture to say I'll put Botswana there, and I'll put Kenya in there, I'll put Ethiopia in there under the new guy. Ethiopia there, I'll put Ethiopia in there.
Rwanda.
Then I'll put Rwanda on the economic, but the politics is problematic. They're my 5. They're my 5 here. Then I'll put Ghana number 1. My 5. So Botswana, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Ghana. But it's with a heavy heart because there's so many problems in those countries, but you force me to choose 5. I will put America there. It's a ghetto, it's a plantation there.
Okay. So we're going to close up. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for everyone taking part. Thank you to our panelists, to our moderator, and for you guys listening. This was about social movement challenging the status quo of good governance. Thank you very much. Yeah, so now it's lunchtime, right? Lunch. Enjoy yourself. No, I just wanted to do that, man. He gave me that like 2 minutes ago. Yeah, so I was just like, that.
The idea is to get the look.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out.